Economic and Budget Outlook Report. My name is Jeff Novak. I'm the Acting Financial Accountability Officer of Ontario. With me is Paul Lewis, our Chief Economist, and Lon No, our Chief Financial Analyst. We'll go through a short presentation providing an overview of our report. I'll have a brief statement, and then we'll be happy to take questions. Paul, over to you.
So we'll start with our slide presentation, and if we get that on the screen. There we go. So just an overview of where we're going. We're going to look at a little bit at what's happened in Ontario's economy and what our projection is. Then we will be covering the budget outlook, and we will also zero in a little bit with some detail on the revenue outlook and our spending profile as well. So let's start with the economic outlook. After the pandemic-induced downturn of 2020, Ontario's economy recorded 2 strong years of robust economic growth. On the left side of the chart, you can see that real GDP, which is the broadest measure of economic activity, and it excludes the impact of inflation, that measure increased by 5.2% in 2021 and then an additional 3.7% in 2022. So that's the strongest 2-year period of economic growth in Ontario in 22 years. During this period of very strong economic growth, demand exceeded supply, and that caused price pressures to build, and CPI inflation reached a 40-year high. Ontario's inflation rate peaked at 7.9% in June of 2022. In response to this, the Bank of Canada rapidly increased interest rates by more than 4 full percentage points starting early last year, and that brought interest rates to their highest level in 16 years. So faced with elevated inflation and higher interest rates, that has slowed economic growth in the province. And the housing market has declined dramatically, and consumer spending has moderated. As a result, we expect the economy to grow by a modest 0.8% in 2023. That's the middle blue bar, followed by 1.5% in 2024, and then 2% over the rest of the outlook. There are risks to this outlook, however. On the downside, inflationary pressures have remained stronger for longer than desired, and in response, the Bank of Canada resumed raising interest rates last week, which, if continued, would slow economic growth further than we expect and would raise the risk of a recession. The U.S. economy has also experienced sticky inflationary pressures and also had financial challenges in some of its banking sector, and that is going to potentially slow growth more than we expect, and that would hurt Ontario's exporters. But there's been some upside momentum in the economy. The global economy has hung in there stronger than many forecasters expected, despite all the uncertainty over the global economy. And also the resilience of Ontario's consumer spending, the tight labor market, and strong population growth, if sustained, could result in economic and revenue growth that would exceed the FAO's projection. Here's our outlook for Ontario's budget balance. And this chart shows that if you look at the blue bar, the small little blue bar in 2022-23, it shows that we expect a surplus of $0.5 billion. And over the outlook, as the economy recovers and improves, we expect that revenue growth will exceed the increases in spending, and that will lead to growing budget surpluses, which reach just over $16 billion by 2027. So with growing budget surpluses, in our report, we expect that Ontario's fiscal sustainability indicators would improve. The province's debt burden, and we measure that by looking at net debt to GDP ratio, it's expected to decline for 7 straight years and fall to 31.8% in 2027. That would bring it back to the level that it was in 2008. Another indicator we watch closely is interest on debt expenses as a share of revenue. And this is an indicator of budget flexibility. So if interest expenses are a smaller share, that means the government has more revenues available for program spending. And we expect that this ratio will fall to a record low of 5.5% in 2027. So what could go wrong with this? Well, we already highlighted some of the challenges that the economy faces. And in addition to that, there are other uncertainties related to our fiscal outlook. If the government makes future policy changes, such as new tax cuts, or spending initiatives, our budget projection would deteriorate. Also, higher inflation may put further upward pressure on public sector wages, and that would boost our program spending outlook. Now I'm going to turn to the revenue outlook. Last year, total revenues surged by 12% as the economy grew rapidly and inflation ramped up. That 12% gain is about 3 times what the province tends to get in a typical year. However, over the outlook, with the economy slowing, we expect the pace of revenue growth to moderate to 6.5% in 22-23 and just 2% in the current fiscal year that we're in. Over the whole outlook, we expect that revenues will increase by an average rate of about 4.4%. Now, if you look at this chart, you'll see that our projection, which is the blue line, is somewhat below the government's. It's $3.4 billion lower in 2022, and it grows to a gap of $4.2 billion in 2025. And that gap largely reflects different assumptions about how inflation is going to affect tax revenues. Revenues have come in stronger than we had expected, both us and the government, in the last couple of years, and that's been the effect of inflation. We expect that trend to continue, but not as strongly as it has in the recent years, and a little bit more moderate than what the government assumption is. So now I'm going to turn over the spending program outlook to Lun.
Thanks, Paul. So this slide shows Ontario's program spending outlook to 2027-28. So in the dark blue line, you'll see the FAO's program spending outlook, and you'll notice that there's a little bump from 2021 to 22-23. We expect that program spending to grow by 7.7% this year, and then grow to $210 billion by 2027-28. This represents an average annual growth rate of around 3.6% per year over this period. In contrast, the pink bar, or the pink line, represents the province's program spending outlook from the 2023 budget. You'll notice that the provincial outlook for program spending is around $5.6 billion higher than the FAO on average from 2022 to 2025-26. Over this period, this results in a cumulative $22.6 billion in excess funds. And these are funds that we estimate are not currently required to support existing programs and commitments. These excess funds could be used by the province to introduce new programs, enhance existing programs, or address other shortfalls. Alternatively, if they do not get used, then they will be automatically applied to increase the surplus and reduce Ontario's net debt. So on the next slide, we break down the $22.6 billion in excess funds across years, but also by sector. You'll see that in health, we estimate that there's $4.4 billion in excess funds, followed by PSC at around $1.1 billion. But the bulk of excess funds sits in other programs in that sector, where it is nearing $18 billion. Notably, other programs is where the contingency is, so most of these excess funds are in the contingency fund. Conversely, there are 3 sectors that we estimate have small shortfalls. These are education, children and social services, and justice. So a shortfall means that the provincial spending plan has not allocated sufficient funding in order to support the programs and existing commitments in these sectors. And with that, I'll turn it back to Jeff to continue with the presentation.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Paul and Lun. So good morning. I'm Jeffrey Novak, the Acting Financial Accountability Officer of Ontario. Today, we're presenting our latest Economic and Budget Outlook report, which provides an independent projection of Ontario's fiscal position and economic outlook to support the work of members of provincial parliament. After 2 years of strong economic growth, Ontario's economy is projected to slow in 2023 and 2024. For 2023, the FAO projects real GDP growth of just 0.8%, reflecting the impact of elevated inflation and higher interest rates on consumer spending and the housing market. Despite the expected slowdown in the economy, the FAO projects that revenue gains will exceed program spending growth over the next 5 years, which will result in growing budget surpluses. The FAO projects a budget surplus of $3 billion this year, rising to $16.4 billion in 2027-28. In the 2023 Ontario budget, the government added $27.8 billion in new funding to its 4-year spending plan. based on the FAO's estimate of the cost of current government programs and announced commitments. This represents $22.6 billion more than what is required to fund provincial programs through 2025. Going forward, the $22.6 billion in excess funds could be used to introduce new programs, enhance existing programs, address spending pressures that could materialize, or improve the government's budget balance. If the excess funds are used to improve the government's budget balance, then Ontario's debt burden would decline for an unprecedented 7 consecutive years. The FAO projects that the province's net debt to GDP ratio would reach 31.8% by 2027-28, the lowest ratio since 2008-09. Thank you, and we would be happy to take questions.
I've a question about how to understand the spending projections. So is it the projection of what the government would need to spend to maintain current service levels like you guys have done before?
So not maintain current service levels. So we've just reviewed the government's programs and costed how much we think those programs will require to spend over the next 5-ish years, and also the announced commitments that the government has made. And so, as we've noted in the health sector, the government is making, significant program expansion commitments, building 30,000 new long-term care homes, expanding the number of hospital beds, and so that's included in our forecast. But it's not an estimate of what it would take to maintain service levels across all government programs. It's just what we think those programs will cost over our outlook.
So I'll use healthcare as the example. So does this see the improvements that the province has promised to make to the healthcare system happen? Like, do we still have hallway healthcare in this forecast, or is that solved because of?
Yeah, so we've looked at that in our last couple of health reports, and so the government is making significant investments, but specifically in the hospital sector. Even with the increase in the hospital beds, our growing and aging population will still make the situation worse in 2027 than it was in 2019-20. And so, I think our report looked at hallway healthcare, and there were about 1,000 people in unconventional spaces each day, and that would be expected to continue given the growing and aging population.
So, but this finds that the government now has room to make additional commitments if they wanted to.
Yeah, that's right. So specifically in the health sector, there's an extra $4.4 billion that is currently not required based on existing programs and commitments. And across all the programs, there's $22.6 billion in excess funds that could be used, as we say, to introduce new programs, enhance programs, fund spending pressures, or improve the budget balance.
Jeff, I'm wondering if you could contextualize the $22.6 billion. How odd is it for governments? I'm not sure if you do comparisons with other provinces or you're aware of how other provinces set aside money, but how unusual is it for a province to set aside $22.6 billion over 4 years?
So for this report, we haven't looked at how that compares across jurisdictions or in the past. Our last report from the winter showed that there was about $11 billion in excess funds. So the government has increased that amount by when they added the $27 billion, that bumped that number up to $22.6 billion. So it's grown year over year, but hard to say how that compares over time.
But in terms of like accounting practices, is this traditional to set aside money that you don't quite allocate to something?
Yeah, so all governments in Ontario have been doing that for a long time in the contingency fund. So I think that's standard practice. The government would call that, building some prudence into their fiscal plan. So that's not unexpected to see that. I think what we're doing is we're just identifying what that total amount is and letting MPPs better understand how to think about the government's budget plan.
Is this a contingency fund, though, from the FAO's perspective?
Well, yeah, so we do know, we can't identify exactly how much it is, but we do know how much the government has set aside in their contingency fund, and we could say like the majority of the $22.6 billion is in the contingency fund. Of course, not all of it is. So in the health sector, that funding is not in the contingency fund, but most of the $22.6 billion is.
Okay. So you could consider this like what, like a rainy day fund? I mean, how would normal? Because I mean, a lot of people will. I mean, you either save for a car or save for a down payment on a house, or some of us just have savings accounts. Is this just a savings account, or?
So that would be a good question for the government. I think what we call it, for lack of a better term, is excess funds, and it's because the way we think about it is we cost the government's programs. And announce commitments. We figure out how much we think that's going to cost, and we just compare that against the government's plan. And so any number beyond that is what we call excess funds. And the government would probably call that prudence for them. And then, how they describe it beyond that, you'd have to ask them.
I'm curious about energy. Is any of that future spending on energy subsidies or anything like that?
So the cost of the energy subsidy programs are included in our outlook. I can look into it for you and get back to you on how much exactly we think that's going to cost. But we have a forecast for that, and that's included in our costing of government programs.
It's not part of the big excess funds and other programs. It's probably not energy.
In terms of, so most of it is the contingency fund. I think, we have a few differences of opinion on a few other programs, and the problem is where it's a little bit hard for us to fully point to it because of cabinet confidence records and that sort of thing. So, I think that's all I can say about that.
Jeff, the government always says the FAO's numbers are a snapshot in time. I'm wondering if you can kind of lay out how the FAO actually derived that $22.6 billion, using the government's own figures, I imagine.
Yeah, sure. So, the government's budget came out in March, and we have access to a wide variety of government information. So once the budget was released, we received a fair amount of information, and so we go through the government spending plan. We also have models for both how much we think programs will cost and how much revenue we think the government will achieve. And I think really the first big difference is that we've developed our forecast up to information, both economics and government announcements to about mid-May or May 20th. And the government's budget came out in March, and so they have a cutoff point which would have been earlier than that. So there's a lot more information that we can reflect in our outlook that the government does not have in their budget, especially in terms of updated spending and an updated revenue outlook. And so it's a combination of that. We get to review government information, and then we have our models that produce a spending and revenue outlook, and that's how we get our outlook.
Is the most recent rate hike included, and if it is, would it make a big difference?
So I'll throw that over to Paul in terms of the rate hike outlook.
So you're talking about last week's Bank of Canada 25 basis point increase. We did not have that in our forecast. Our forecast was locked earlier than that, and we assumed the bank would keep rates unchanged through the course of this year. But we were also very cautious with our economics, and when we locked the numbers a month or so ago, indicators have come in fairly strong. So if anything, there's a little bit of upside risk to our outlook. However, as we identified in our risk section, if the bank continues to increase interest rates, then that might result in a lower pace of growth than we have predicted.
I've got some other questions about, you mentioned that if they do have 7 years of surpluses, this would be historical. I don't think I've seen a surplus since I started reporting at Queen's Park. Can you sort of explain how unusual that would be, and sort of what would be the driver of the big change from years and years of deficits and maybe one fairly balanced budget to this potential for large surpluses for a while?
Sure, I'll start. So you last year the government did record a surplus, so we have seen one in recent times, and then I think what's the big difference has been really exceptional revenue growth, and that's been driven by the recovery from the pandemic, but also the inflationary environment that we're in. So that I think has been the big difference. Well, Paul, do you have anything to add to that?
That's really what's driven our outlook, is revenues just were so much reset by the high inflation environment. it kind of really changed our outlook. If you go back to the early 80s, which is pretty much all the fiscal history we have, there's only been a handful of times that there's been budget surpluses, and they tend to be sporadic, not strung together. So this would be an unprecedented period.
Can I ask, just along the vein of rising interest rates, we also saw job losses for the first time in about a year. I know one report doesn't necessarily make a trend, but at what point do you think, maybe Paul, there would be concern? Is it a 3-month mark of steady job losses? At what point should the province be worried?
So, yeah, that's a tough question, because the data is for 1 month is it's not totally reliable always, not a great indicator. If you go back to the fall, there was a 5-month period where Ontario lost jobs in 4 of those months, and that's got my attention. And yet the economy continued to grow, and we ran into a period where we had 6-7 months of job growth. And the most recent number, it was very weak, but it was a lot to do with seasonal adjustment factors, kind of technical stuff that Statistics Canada has to work through. But if you take a look at the last 6-month period and you look at private sector job growth in Ontario, that is about strongest we've had since the late 1970s. It's been extraordinary. So what I would be really watching for is if there's momentum on job losses, and if they start to affect core age workers, and you start to see the unemployment rate trend upwards as well. So if you get 5-6 months of that, then that's a signal that the economy may be slowing more than we would expect.
Okay, for the two of us.
Thanks very much, guys.